Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Thursday, January the 15th, 2026. Today should be Martin Luther King Day because it is Martin Luther King's birthday. He would be 97 years old if he was still alive because he was born on January the 15th. 1929. Of course, America doesn't celebrate Martin Luther King Day always on his birthday. Rather, I think on following Monday. I think that's how they do it. So Martin Luther King Day is going to actually be on January the 19th. But anyway, I do want to have a quick look at Martin Luther King's horoscope. I also want to consider the horoscope of Jerome Powell, chair of the Federal Reserve. He apparently is being prosecuted, or there is some talk about charges against him. I think he allegedly didn't tell the truth when it came to him testifying about the refurbishment of the Federal Reserve. And of course, Trump is not a big fan of Jerome Powell, and so there are a couple of things going on in Jerome Powell's chart of mention, and that's all linked with the fact that there is a Venus-Uranus trine today. So yeah, that is something that does need to be talked about. But first of all, I want to consider the astrology and the I Ching for today. This chart is set for noon New York time on Thursday, January the 15th. I'm a bit tongue-tied today. I'm not quite sure why. But anyway, so here is the chart for today. By the way, don't forget to like and subscribe if appropriate. So here we see that the moon is at 20 degrees Sagittarius. So today the moon is solidly in Sagittarius. Doesn't matter where you are. That's where it is. And the moon is not doing a huge amount in Sagittarius. It's starting to make a trine to Saturn, and square to Saturn. It's starting to make a square to Saturn, and it is making a trine to Chiron. So that square Saturn, perhaps isn't great. So very late in the day, you might start to feel its impact. Additionally, we have Venus making a sextile to Saturn and a trine to Uranus. So there's Venus, right at the end of Capricorn, getting ready to move into Aquarius. And I think is it over the weekend? Yeah, but Venus moves into Aquarius. So it's getting close. The Aquarius season is almost upon us. So Venus makes a sextile to Venus in Capricorn, makes a sextile to Saturn in Pisces. I think that's quite a useful aspect because you have Venus in the sign of Saturn, Venus in Capricorn, Saturn in the exaltation of Venus, because Venus is exalted in Pisces. So that is a good relationship between Venus and Saturn. And then Venus moves on and makes a trine to Uranus in Taurus. And I will be talking about that Venus trine Taurus later in the video. But I think that aspect is probably fairly benign. At least in terms of what it means theoretically. Though one does have to consider other things about it. The thing is about this Venus... The thing about this Venus trine Uranus is that Saturn is on the midpoint. So what we actually have is Saturn on the Venus-Uranus midpoint. Now that actually could be quite important because Saturn might moderate how that Venus-Uranus aspect is felt, because Venus-Uranus, is about potentially things happening quickly and suddenly, perhaps in terms of relationships, but there is a Saturnine influence, and I'll be looking at that later in the video. So that's a chart if we set it for New York. If we set the chart for Sydney, Australia, there's not a huge amount of difference. Moon is still in Sagittarius, so there's not much difference. The moon is not making that trine to Chiron, and so if you're in Australasia, compared to the US. Maybe things will be ever so slightly slower and uneventful, but I think that's, that is as far as it goes. And then there is the heliocentric view. This is when we put the Earth, we put the Sun at the center of the solar system, where it should be. And we've been tracking the heliocentric picture. We've been tracking how the Earth has been making a conjunction to Jupiter, and it's been making an opposition to Mars. And heliocentrically, we can see that Mercury is in heliocentric Capricorn, and it is moving towards an opposition to the Earth and a conjunction to Mars. So Mercury is about to trigger Mars and Jupiter. That's going to happen quite soon, because remember, Mercury is a fast mover. Mercury only takes 88 days to go around the Sun. So in a couple of days' time, we're going to see that Mercury conjunct Mars, Mercury opposition Jupiter, and Mercury square Chiron. And right now we've got Earth square Chiron. Earth is exactly square Chiron. It was pretty close yesterday. And as I said yesterday, if Earth is square Chiron, some of us might feel that it's time to take a stand. I do regard Chiron as being a potentially rebellious energy, and it's about getting noticed. Sometimes getting noticed has a cost. It can have a very serious cost. You can potentially lose your life if you're in the wrong political system, making too much noise, standing up for yourself. You can get shot, executed, whatever. So that is a real wound there. But even in our everyday lives with Earth square Chiron, there might be a pressure to really tell people what we feel, and it might be a question of standing up against injustice, for example. So let's see how that Earth square Chiron works. But it is a heliocentric square. We've had the Sun square Chiron. Now it's Earth square Chiron heliocentrically, and heliocentric aspects tend to be higher level. They're perhaps not so accessible as geocentric aspects. So there might be this sort of high level pressure to stand out, to say something that rocks the boat, but maybe we can ignore it. Maybe it depends who we are. Maybe it depends on our situation. So that's the heliocentric view, and now I want to look at things from the viewpoint of the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for the 12 signs for today, which is Thursday, January the 15th, 2026. Aries. I don't think there's anything that you absolutely have to do. So you shouldn't feel obliged. And, it's probably good that you don't feel that you have this sense of obligation. I mean, sometimes you need the time to think and to plan and also to be inspired. And if you feel a constant sense of obligation, it may be difficult to do anything of personal worth. And that's perhaps a key point, personal worth. Something that you want to do, that matters to you, may not matter to anyone else, and you want to do it in your own way, at your own pace, and you don't want to feel obliged, you don't want to feel blocked. So if you want to do something, you do it, and then you do something else, and you move on, and you just enjoy the variety of being alive. And so have as much freedom as possible, though with the moon trine Chiron, this is perhaps a bit of a follow-up. So we have had Mars square Chiron. A few days ago I did a whole video about Mars square Chiron. Of course, Mars is your ruler. Now with moon trine Chiron, well, Chiron is in Aries, and this means that perhaps Aries, you can assert yourself, assert your beliefs, but in a way that really doesn't involve too much pressure. It's very easy, perhaps, to be a rebel or to experiment with stirring things up. That is sometimes something that Aries likes to do. You say a few things, you let off a few fireworks, not literal fireworks, but you just like to do that sometimes, and just to see what happens, to see if you can get a reaction. And I think if you want to get a reaction, Aries, I think you can, and you can probably do it with very little risk. And don't forget that words can be important. You have plenty of things you'd like to say, and you're able to pack your words very effectively, and your words can carry the essence of who you are, and so people listen to what you say, and you're making it clear, you're not hiding anything. And so feel free to just say what's on your mind. I don't think that you're going to have a hugely dramatic impact. I mean, just don't think the overall astrological situation is like that. It's perhaps all too easy, and so maybe you can actually go quite a long way, be quite outrageous, and people will just say, okay, fine, or they might, at some level, not rise to the bait. So, well, you could say, Aries, that is a good reason to escalate. You might have to really be extra outrageous if you want to get a reaction. And so that does give you a lot of freedom. You can really do largely what you want, and you can decide at what level you want to operate. Now, do consider other people. I mean, they can't be entirely ignored. I mean, we've got Venus making a few aspects. Venus is making a sextile to Saturn. Venus is making a trine to Uranus. And so those two Venus aspects can say something about the people in your life and how they are behaving, how they are responding. You are not the only person who is an individual. And with Venus trine Uranus, Venus in Capricorn, trine Uranus in Taurus, it's possible that someone does something that you weren't expecting. You can have expectations, and you can try to fit other people into your expectations, and someone does something, and that is surprising. And maybe you should pay attention. This is especially the case if you're going into work today, or you have a particular direction and you're expecting a degree of cooperation from other people. Venus can represent someone you're working with, perhaps someone in authority, could be, but it's trine Uranus. But trine Uranus might be about something unexpected. So your immediate response could be negative, but it is a trine, and Venus is in Capricorn. It's in a high profile part of your chart, and so it's possible that you can actually benefit from someone doing something unusual. It's not just you that wants to come up with the excitement or can come up with the excitement. Someone else can do something strange, and if you take note of it and you see it in a positive light, then that might be the basis for future action and future initiatives. Taurus. Venus is your ruling planet, and it's doing things. It's making a trine to Uranus. So that potentially is important. Remember that Uranus is moving through Taurus. Taurus is, of course, your sign. And so with Venus trine Uranus, you should, as far as possible, try to be an individual. It's not a day for just fitting in with other people's expectations. Sure, there might be pressure to fit in, but I think that is pressure that you can resist, and you need to remember, yeah, Uranus is in Taurus. It is still moving through Taurus, and it will be in Taurus for a bit longer, a couple more months. And Uranus in Taurus, it's really asking you to be an individual. And as a Taurus, you can be someone who is quite stubborn. You hold on to what you believe in, but stubbornness just for the sake of it isn't really going to take you anywhere. It could actually be quite destructive. And with Venus trine Uranus, you have the capacity to be different, to be an individual, but in quite a constructive way. And maybe before you start to think about how you're going to challenge other people, you're going to have to think about how you're going to be challenging yourself. So you should not make assumptions. You certainly shouldn't make assumptions, for example, about what you believe in, the way things are. Many Taurians have a philosophy. They have an often very rigid set of beliefs. But, every now and then those beliefs need to be ever so slightly changed. And with Venus trine Uranus, you perhaps have a realization that some of your belief structures have basically outlived their usefulness, and they just need to be adjusted. I'm not saying you have to change your mind in every single way, or change your fundamental philosophy, or change your religion. It's not quite like that. But, you do need to consider that not everything is quite as you think it is. And with that Venus trine Uranus, you have the opportunity to create some change in yourself. And once you've created change in yourself, you can project that change outwards onto the environment and onto other people. Additionally, Venus is making a sextile to Saturn, and this Venus sextile Saturn, you can't really see it in isolation. You have to really see Venus as being as aspecting both Saturn and Uranus. So what happens is you get the sextile to Saturn first, and then you get the trine to Uranus. So that means that you can be quite disciplined about the whole thing, and it's perhaps about respecting what is worth holding on to, but also knowing that if nothing changes, you might lose everything. Now let me kind of explain that. It means that if you have a rigid structure, and every structure becomes rigid, and it might become outdated, and you change nothing, then in the end, that structure is just going to collapse, because inertia in the end will kill it. But if you make some small changes, if you can be flexible, if you can understand that you haven't got a monopoly on the truth, you might have 90% of a picture, but that's just that 10% that you might have got completely wrong. And so by making a few changes, and by perhaps listening to what other people are saying, you can make a big difference to yourself, and you can give yourself permanence, and you can give your ideas permanence. And so really do consider what needs to be changed and what can be changed. And additionally, Taurus, I think right now you do have a strong sense of yourself, and you can be quite extreme if you want to be. But the question is, how useful is that? It's only useful if you are really, really sure of yourself. You need to know what you're doing. Yeah, you can create huge effects at the moment. But if you're going to create huge effects, you need to be sure of your ground. And one way of being sure of your ground is to think about that Venus trine Uranus, just by making a few changes, if you kind of have an inkling that you are wrong about something, just accept it. You're wrong. You accept yourself that you're wrong, and then all of a sudden things just come together and you are in a much stronger position, and you can really assert yourself and just not be worried about the consequences. People will take you seriously. You will be listened to. I mean, even if they don't listen to you, you can definitely get results today. Gemini. Moon continues moving through Sagittarius, and the moon in Sagittarius is not doing a great deal. So, this might say something about other people, about, relationships, what people are doing. There might today be a lot of promise. It seems that a lot of different things could be happening, but the question is, are they happening? And the answer, might be no. It's almost like you have to be on standby, because you never know what other people are going to come up with. But in the end, they come up with nothing. So don't spend all your time worrying about what anyone is going to do next, because despite various promises, absolutely nothing might happen. And so, Gemini, perhaps it's a day when you can fall back on your own resources and think about who you are, and what you want to project. Because deep down, Gemini, you do have a strong idea about who you are and what you can achieve, and it's okay to be optimistic. But if you are going to be optimistic about something, even crazily optimistic, I think there's probably at least one area, Gemini, where you really believe that something amazing can happen. But the thing is, how do you respond to other people? How do you talk about your optimism? Well, it may be the case, Gemini, that the moment you talk about the thing you're most optimistic about, the moment you talk about it, you destroy it. It's a sign that actually it's not going to work. And so if you want something to happen and it's really important to you, then perhaps it's a situation where you say nothing. Because, at some unconscious level, how it's going to work. You maybe can predict the future. You can see a possibility. But in terms of the oracle, we all are our own oracle. If you observe yourself, it's like looking at the entrails, and if you go and talk about what you want, what you hope for, well, that's a bad omen. You almost want to admit yourself that it can't possibly happen. And so I would have said, Gemini, the less said, the better. That can be difficult for Geminis, because Geminis often have a lot to say. But I would have said, if you are going to say anything today, just keep it light, keep it to issues that aren't important to you, because you might actually be oversensitive to external feedback, and you say something, you get a negative response, and you could just feel really bad. And so the important things are really a matter between you and yourself. Of course, in most cases, sometimes there is a matter of importance that does need to be discussed. You can't keep everything secret, but secrecy does play a role for the moment. I mean, it's not going to be like this forever. Things are starting to change, or are about to change. Venus is in very late Capricorn. It's going to move into Aquarius very soon. But over the next couple of days, maybe there isn't much to be said. And we indeed have a build up to a new moon. That's something I almost missed. The moon is in Sagittarius. It's about to leave Sagittarius. Won't be leaving Sagittarius today, but tomorrow, Friday, it'll be out of Sagittarius, and we do get the run up to this new moon. And I'll be talking about this new moon in much greater detail very soon. But this new moon for you, Gemini, is about secrecy, and you should not forget that this is right at the end of a lunar cycle. This is not a time for initiating anything new. It's about tying up loose ends. And if you do try to initiate something new or to start a new conversation about an important subject, it'll be a question of bad timing. So just hold on, Gemini. Things are about to improve. Of course, I'm talking to myself here to an extent because I've got my sun in Gemini, and I've got big hopes for Aquarius season, and so be optimistic, but don't be openly optimistic. I think right now that is important. Cancer. I'm not sure if a huge amount is going on right now. There's just no action. Maybe it's a case, Cancer, of just everyone being exhausted. We've had this sort of huge conjunction in Capricorn, and it's really been weighing on many of us. We've seen what's been going on in the world. We saw this big revolt in Iran, and it's interesting with that revolt in Iran. It really seemed to gather steam as we saw all those planets coming together in Capricorn. But now that this conjunction is starting to break up, the revolt is dissipating. A lot of people were really excited about the fall of the Iranian regime, but now it sort of doesn't look as if it's going to happen. And so that just tells us something about what is going on, and perhaps how you may feel. I mean, you may have no interest in Iran or very little interest in Iran, I don't know, but it's just a symbol for what is going on. And so as far as you're concerned, it might be a time of just recovery, and because not a great deal is going on, that kind of puts less pressure on you. You don't have to be in the forefront of things, and you've sort of managed to get through the Mars-Jupiter opposition, difficult aspect, Mars-Jupiter opposition, but you've survived it. Congratulations. And now the only lunar aspect of note is Moon trine Chiron. And this Moon trine Chiron, it's not necessarily an aspect that you have to take into account, but you could if you wanted to. And as far as interpreting this Moon trine Chiron, it's a trine. Trine is a fairly optional kind of aspect. It's an easy aspect, and so if you want to be useful, you certainly can be, and it just may be that going out of your way for someone, and maybe we could get into the wounded healer aspect of Chiron, just going out of your way for someone to some extent, giving someone some of your time, some of your effort, some of your energy, just could make such a big difference with this Moon trine Chiron. It may be that there's someone who's got a problem, just can't sort it out themselves, and you're there. So if you're there, if you're around, it's not a big deal to help them. Just maybe half an hour of your time just could make a huge difference. Additionally, Moon trine Chiron might be talking about some gentle reorganization, which in its own way is a minor act of rebellion. You change things round. You know that you're not necessarily following protocol or following other people's procedures, and it might be frowned upon, but no one's going to know what you're doing. So if you want to rearrange things in a way that is non-standard with Moon trine Chiron, I think you can, and it will work in your best interest in a subtle way. It's nothing huge. It's nothing dramatic, and yeah, it is optional. And I think that optionality is a key point about today, because I don't think there need be any pressure. The pressure has already happened, and ideally, Cancer, today is just about maybe gentle and optional self-organization. Yes, self-organization, the kind of organization that might go under the radar. Leo, Uranus is still in Taurus. Well, I have to say that. I have to say that every now and then, because Taurus is an important is an important sign for you. In the Leo chart, Taurus is at the top, and Taurus can be a sign that is related to success, achievement, a sense of direction. And with Uranus moving through this sign, it's a time to be shaking things up, for being a real individual. Uranus did, of course, briefly leave Uranus did briefly leave Taurus. It went into Gemini, but it's now back in Taurus, and it will be back in Taurus for a few months. And so that is a reminder, this is a time when you shouldn't just accept that absolutely everything is sorted out, that everything is resolved. I mean, it's not. And, today we've got Venus trine Uranus. And Venus is a planet which does matter. And Venus perhaps represents, what you are trying to achieve, how you are trying to do it. And with Venus trine Uranus, it might be a time when you should be starting to put into action the changes that you think are important. So think about it, Leo. Think about how you would like to be an individual. Think about what you'd really like to do. If there was no social pressure, if there was no pressure from superiors, if you're at work, or perhaps no pressure from your family. If there was no pressure, well, what would you go and do? And think about that. And Venus trine Uranus is basically telling you, well, you can do it. You can start. And you might think, Leo, that it's such a big thing that you don't know what to do. Absolutely not. It's just a waste of time. But this Venus trine Uranus is saying, oh, no, there's absolutely something you can do. And what you can do is it's about really split things up. Decide what would be the first step. It might be a very small step, but with Venus trine Uranus, you take the first step in that rebellion. Maybe it is a rebellion. I mean, it's a rebellion because you want to do things differently. You take that first step and you stabilize it. You make it part of your life, part of your routine, because Venus is also making a sextile to Saturn, and that sextile Saturn does allow you to create stability, to give things permanence. And so you do something small, you give it permanence. Then you do something else small, you give it permanence. You keep going, and in the end, by the time Uranus moves into Gemini in a few months' time, then you'll see that things have really completely changed, and perhaps this is a good time to make a start if you haven't already made a start. And at the same time, Leo, just don't underestimate yourself. Don't underestimate how different, how wonderful you can be, and how clever you are. Absolutely don't. And I'm saying this because right now the sun is The sun is on the Mercury-Venus midpoint. I mean, the sun is, well, it's making a conjunction to Mercury and it's making a conjunction to Venus. Very wide conjunctions, well, relatively wide, but the point is it's between conjunctions. So if you look at the chart, you've got Sun at 25 degrees Capricorn, Mercury is at 21 degrees Capricorn or 22 degrees Capricorn, Venus is at 27 degrees Capricorn. So Sun is, right in the middle, right between Mercury and Venus. So you get the power of this double conjunction because you're on the midpoint. And of course, the sun is your ruler. It does matter. And so, Leo, right now, you really can get in connection, get in touch with your fundamental abilities. Now, it might not be very dramatic. You might slightly underestimate yourself, but you have to also remember that the moon is in Sagittarius. The moon is in Sagittarius. It's in a very creative part of your chart. So you bring this all together, and it may well be the case, Leo, that you can do things which are, frankly, of exceptional quality. And if you're good at something, it's going to be obvious. So, give yourself a chance. It's certainly not a time for modesty. Leo is not a modest sign. I'm not saying it's an arrogant sign, but, you can have too much of modesty. And so, do believe in yourself. And, part of it is a question of structure and organization. It's not just about, making a big show, doing something completely dramatic. No, it's more understated than that. And, that's the way it should be done. So you put everything together, Leo, and I think that it can be a really good day. I'm not saying it's going to be a completely easy day. I mean, there's certainly work to be done, but if you believe in yourself and you believe that things can change and you think back to what you really wanted to do, perhaps think back not just a few months, but maybe think back to when Uranus went into Taurus for the first time. That would be what, I don't know, 7 years ago. I don't know about the exact date. It was something, Uranus stays in the sign for around 7 years. So so think back to what you've been trying to achieve over the last few years, and there may just be this achievement gap. You were almost there, but not quite there. But you're now getting another chance, and you're now getting a chance to be a unique, talented individual who's able to really maximize their potential. And I mean, I know that sounds a bit dramatic, but I mean, I do mean it. And so think about how the events today and your thoughts today and your opportunities today, how they can all come together. Virgo. Moon continues moving through Sagittarius. The moon is not doing a great deal in Sagittarius. And that may say something about today. I mean, not just for you, but potentially for everyone. Things are going at a slower pace. And from a Virgo perspective, well, that might not be such a bad thing. Recently we've had, a lot of excitement. We've had, this massive conjunction in Capricorn. But, that conjunction is starting to break up. And now, Virgo, you're starting to get, more of a perspective on things. And so, Virgo, this possibly gives you a degree of freedom. So there may actually be an axis of freedom and excitement. You think about excitement as being about freedom. But maybe not. When there's more excitement, when there's a lot of excitement, you're kind of locked into a pattern. You have to follow through with this excitement. You have to become part of other people's excitement. But when there's no excitement, when everything seems a bit boring, maybe this is the point, Virgo, where you actually have a great deal of freedom, and you can largely do what you want. And Mercury is your ruler. Mercury is still, very much in Capricorn, and we've got to build up to a Capricorn to a Capricorn new moon. That's coming up very soon, a couple of days' time. The moon is about to go into Capricorn, so maybe that's something to be looking forward to. I will be talking in more detail about this new moon in a few days' time. But fundamentally, this Capricorn energy is still there. It's not as strong as it used to be, but it does remind you of what you are able to do. And even if things are quieter, the vision is still there, and you do seem to have a vision. If you are honest with yourself, you are quite sort of optimistic. You're aware of what could happen if things turned out right. But how do things turn out right? Well, things turn out right maybe if you're just left alone. You're not trying to impress anyone. You don't have to do anything, and if you are in control, and you can be in control, then I'm pretty optimistic about the way things can work out. And additionally, we have a trine between Venus and Uranus. So Venus in Capricorn is trine Uranus in Taurus. And so this aspect inevitably impacts Virgo, because Venus in Capricorn is kind of trine Virgo. Uranus in Taurus is trine Virgo. So the Venus-Uranus energy is hitting you. So this Venus-Uranus, I know it sounds exciting, but you have to remember that Venus is in Capricorn, Uranus is in Taurus. So I think that the energy is quite sort of understated. But Venus and Uranus together, if we try to understand what that aspect means, okay, you could talk about relationships, but you could also talk about independence. And, it is a very independent aspect of Venus trine Uranus. I mean, I'll be talking about Venus trine Uranus later in the video, but it is about easily being able to express who you are and who you are not. And that's what today is about. And you don't have to express yourself in a dramatic way. You just know that you have your own path, that no one can get in the way of this path, and you can be yourself, and you can do things you enjoy. And by doing things you enjoy, you can just get in touch with something else. Maybe you can get in touch with what it's all about, what it's all about, perhaps what this life is all about. What you're here for. And so utilize that Venus trine Uranus. And at the same time, Saturn is making a sextile to Venus, and so that really helps. I think it allows you to really ground yourself, and also to ground your individuality. It's not just a passing phase. Your individuality is real, and it can really become a permanent part of who you are. It's not something temporary. It is real, and this is perhaps part of what all those planets in Capricorn were doing. They were reminding you of just what you can do, and it might become even clearer at the time of a new moon. And the new moon is upon us, because the moon is about to move into Capricorn. Moon is about to be in the same sign as Capricorn. So overall, Virgo, I think that today can be very constructive, and you can get a real sense of what can be done and how this links to your broader destiny. Libra. Venus is your ruling planet, of course, and it receives, or is making, a sextile to Saturn and a trine to Uranus. So that the Venus trine Uranus is probably the aspect I want to focus on more than the Venus sextile Saturn, but we probably shouldn't just see them as being separate. And with Venus trine Uranus, that does stir things up. But we have to remember that this trine is taking place in earth signs. So it's not necessarily about dramatic events in the outside world. The action is perhaps taking place at a more personal level. It's what you are thinking, it's what you're experiencing. Your ideas about what's happening in your life and how you are responding. And Venus trine Uranus, there is something quite revolutionary about it. I mean, Uranus is a planet of revolutions, and you might just have an insight that starts on an emotional level. It's just the way you feel. Something feels different, or you feel that something is starting to develop, is starting to take form, and you realize that it is a change, and it is a change for the better. And then with Venus sextile Saturn, I think that this Venus sextile Saturn is a great aspect. I said this in the introduction to this video, because Venus and Saturn, Venus is in Capricorn, which is Saturn's sign. Saturn is in Pisces. Venus is exalted in Pisces. So Venus and Saturn are in mixed reception. It does link up with you. And of course, Saturn does have a relationship to Libra through exaltation. So Venus sextile Saturn suggests to me that you can really get yourself together, and you can take something which is original, which relates to the future, and you can just make it part of your daily life and your daily routine, and you don't have to make a fuss about it. But something very big and revolutionary is happening, and it's like no one knows about it. It's all under the surface. So if you want to do anything that's secret, and you don't want to broadcast your intentions and your plans, well, go ahead. I think that secret approach, is the best way for handling things. And at the same time, Libra, you do seem to have a very strong sense of self and what you want. And if there is something that you want, then I'm really confident that you can get it. And the key is not to spend too much time thinking about it. We don't have any planets in air signs at the moment. We have, it's just Pluto. And from a Libran perspective, that might seem a bit difficult. You are an air sign, and you perhaps feel you need some support, through ideas, maybe about talking about things, being able to play with ideas. But it's not about that. It's about you, Libra, just having something in your head, you decide you want it, and your willpower is very, very strong. So once you commit yourself to something, then what can stop you? And perhaps the only issue here is making that first commitment. You may not want to make a commitment. You may be afraid of making a commitment. But once you decide that something is going to be, you're going to make it happen, then Libra, I think you can. And once you start something, I think you'll be a hard person to stop. Scorpio. It's a day, Scorpio, when activity levels have kind of dropped off, and it's not just about you. When we try to work out what's going on, we do spend quite a lot of time looking at the moon and what the moon is doing. And at the moment the moon is in Sagittarius, and it's not doing much. The moon is out of your sign. It's been out of your sign for a couple of days now, and so with the moon in Sagittarius, you kind of have a feeling that you perhaps need to sort of vaguely keep an eye on your finances, maybe. And the material side of things just can't be ignored. But there may not be anything specific that you are particularly bothered about, and so that might be it. Now, as far as other people are concerned, well, there is a trine between Venus and Uranus. There's also a sextile between Venus and Saturn. So it could be, Scorpio, But if there is any action today, it relates to, what other people are up to. So you take, Venus trine Uranus. So Venus is a very social planet, and it might say something about, what other people are up to. You shouldn't necessarily have expectations about anyone. People might be a law unto themselves, and they might do things that you hadn't necessarily planned for. And they might also say things that you hadn't planned for. So if something happens that seems unusual, that comes out of the blue, don't panic. It's just another person's individuality, and give people a chance to be themselves. And in the process, you might have to talk to them, and if you're talking to people, the conversation might go in a somewhat interesting direction. But again, don't worry about it. When you are talking and conversing right now, you are quite natural about it. Mars is your ruler. It's still in Capricorn. It's a very communicative place for Mars to be. And there are a few things you can't talk about. Now, there may be some things you don't want to talk about, but the words will eventually flow. So if you are confused by a situation, if something happens that you hadn't expected, if someone does something that seems unusual, then talk about it. Ask someone to explain themselves. And it might seem to be a waste of time, but I don't think it is. And it's possible that the words will flow, and you'll be able to in the end make sense of things. And additionally, when there is a lot of verbal toing and froing, that might create some new possibilities, and you might actually start to understand, where you fit in, because that's perhaps part of a problem today. Perhaps you don't entirely know where you fit in, and if you keep quiet, then you really won't know. But by talking to other people, by understanding their views, even if those views are rather unusual, you can just start to get an idea of what it's all about, and slowly but surely you might sort of start to get an idea about your particular role. And if you're doing anything practical, or if you're working today, I don't know if you work, but if you do, then you might gently surprise yourself. You might realize that you actually are really good at something that that hadn't occurred to you, and the talent will be obvious to you, increasingly obvious to you, and in the end it will also be obvious to other people. So looking at today in general, I think it doesn't seem to be very problematic. Things are pretty straightforward. I think that it might be uneventful, but you do have to consider what other people are up to, and other people might have a surprise, but it's a surprise that really shouldn't bother you. You can go with it, and if you talk, you ask questions, then you'll understand what's going on, and you'll feel that you're not alienated, but in fact you can very much be part of everything. Sagittarius. The moon is still moving through your sign. It's not doing very much. I mean, it's making a trine to Chiron. That is the main lunar aspect. So if you've got the moon trine Chiron, you might say, Sagittarius, that you can certainly be an individual in your own quiet way. You certainly don't have to fit in with anything. You don't have to fit in with anyone else's expectations. And if there's something you want to do, particularly if it's sort of unusual, rather radical, you can do it. it might not be noticed. Maybe you want it to be noticed, but why should you want it to be noticed? If you're not bothered, if no one is asking questions, then that does give you a lot of freedom. But just don't expect massive results, certainly in terms of how other people are responding. Though with Moon trine Chiron, if you want to take a stand, I do think you can. If you want to really express your individuality, there really shouldn't be a problem. And there just might not be much of a reaction, which could be something of a disappointment. Now, it's possible that some Sagittarians might want to scatter their energy, too far. That would be particularly the case if you're the kind of Sagittarian that gets bored easily. So if you get bored easily, and there's reason to get bored today, perhaps because you're not getting a reaction, you might feel that you have to push forward into other areas. You try one thing, you don't get a reaction, you move into you try something else, and there could be just some part of you that is looking for outrage, but wants some kind of response. And this may be reflected in what you say and what you do, and yet how far are you going to take it? So if you want to be outrageous, if you want to do something that is in some respects unacceptable, well, there's certainly the temptation there. But Sagittarius, you have to be careful how far you go. Some Sagittarians might go too far in the wrong direction and find themselves involved in something that isn't necessarily very, very savory. Now, on a more positive note, Venus is trine Uranus. I mean, Venus trine Uranus is arguably, the main aspect of the day. Okay, there's Venus sextile Saturn. Now, this Venus trine Uranus it can be an aspect which is quite material. I mean, this Venus trine Uranus is in Earth signs. I mean, Venus in Capricorn, Uranus in Taurus, and so that's where it operates in terms of your life. And Venus trine Uranus, if you make the effort, you could have some ideas about the way perhaps money is organized. With all these planets in Capricorn, Sagittarius, it is a sign in the Sagittarius chart which has a strong financial connection, and then you throw the trine to Uranus, and it might just be that you look at money and you look at how money is organized, and you're thinking, well, maybe things could be better. And perhaps certain people, certain institutions have taken you for granted. If you're dealing with with a bank, for example, they may feel they may have been pushing you around, or just assuming you'll just do what you're told, or whatever. But you do want to be an individual. I'm not giving financial advice here. I'm just suggesting this as a possibility. And then we got Venus sextile Saturn. And so this Venus sextile Saturn, again, that says something about money and how it's being organized. And it might be that, having got a vision about how things could be changed or should be changed with Venus sextile Saturn, you might want to really make the effort to make this change something permanent. And so you might want to, make a fuss, or in a quiet kind of way. I mean, it's not a noisy day, but do think about how your financial affairs are organized and how you've been interacting with institutions, like banks, and maybe the relationship hasn't been perfect, and you have a chance now to make some changes and to also perhaps be heard. And so I know that money from a Sagittarian perspective, can be a rather boring subject, but it is an area where you can really show your individuality. But don't do any. I'm not suggesting you do anything dramatic or that you take financial risks. It's just something for you to bear in mind. Capricorn. Today sees a sextile between Venus and Saturn. I think that this sextile is really good. I mean, Venus and Saturn are in mixed reception with one another. Saturn is in Pisces, which is a sign where Venus is exalted. Venus is in Capricorn. Of course, Capricorn is Saturn's sign. So this Venus Saturn mutual reception, mixed reception, and the fact they're in sextile as well, you should really help you out. And it's an aspect which allows you, I think, to be relatively lucky, but it's not the kind of luck that just comes from nowhere. It's a luck that comes through your own efforts. This is a sextile. A sextile is not quite as easy as a trine. A sextile, remember, is 2 times 3. 2 times 3 is 6. A sextile is a sixth of a circle. So there is a 3. That's a sort of a trine number, but there's also a 2 there, and a 2 represents the dynamism there. So you have the opportunity to put some effort in, and you put in the effort, and you get the results. So whatever it is that you're trying to do over the course of the day, I think that you can do a really good job, and you'll have no difficulty expressing yourself. And I think that people will understand. But you don't have to make a big fuss. I think that in most cases, everything is just naturally going to come together. And this Venus sextile Saturn is quite a practical aspect. I mean, Venus, of course, is in an earth sign, and it might relate to your ambitions. And so if there's something you're trying to do, something you're trying to get together, then you can certainly make really sort of good progress. So, do remember that, because, when you first hit today, when you kind of won't become aware that it's Thursday, you might be of a view that there really isn't much going on. There isn't much to apply to. And so that negativity could mean that you lose an opportunity. But as soon as you actually interact with the day, I mean, you've got to make that effort to begin with. As soon as you interact with the day, you'll find that things just come together, naturally. Yeah, sure, they require a little bit of work, but not too much work. It's not too much effort. So I think that, through the day, I can just see you making, solid progress. And Venus, having made that sextile to Saturn, it makes a trine to Uranus. Uranus is in Taurus, Venus is in Capricorn. So that Venus trine Uranus, it might be that today, begins quite slowly and maybe in quite a plodding way. Sure, you're making progress, but it's not necessarily too exciting. And then suddenly something comes together, and one thing leads to another, and you're starting to see things in a new way, and there may even be a bit of excitement. Perhaps you have a realization. Something suddenly becomes clear to you. And it doesn't necessarily have to be explained. Certainly it doesn't have to be explained to other people. It might be quite an internal process. But, by the end of the day, you're feeling that you've really got to grips with things. And yeah, there might be a sense of excitement. And also remember that, the moon is in late Sagittarius. So the fact that the moon is in late Sagittarius, that's one reason why, to begin with, things might feel a bit slow. But the moon is soon enough going to go into Capricorn. Tomorrow it moves into Capricorn, and then we get the build-up to a new moon. So we've got a Capricorn new moon coming up over the next few days. So it is kind of coming together. And with this Venus sextile Saturn, well, we shouldn't forget that, Venus is often seen as a planet of relationships. So if relationships are of any importance to you, if you're concerned about how you're getting on with people particularly on a one-to-one level, then that Venus may represent someone who does find you interesting, wants to get closer to you. They may even feel somewhat reliant on you. Maybe you've got things they don't have. And Venus, it's in Capricorn. In other words, it's in your sign. It's a situation where you have a lot of power. And, I think in terms of a power equation, you seem to have most of the cards. And so with Venus sextile Saturn, it means that one particular relationship can start to really come together, and it's a relationship that can unfold, on your terms. I'm not saying that you have to be, completely in control or anything like that, but there's certainly no need to worry about relationships or worry too much about anyone getting too close to you. I mean, you have a strong sense of boundaries, and Venus is not just sextile Saturn; it is trine Uranus. Venus trine Uranus is a very independent-minded aspect, as I'll be talking or saying later on in this video. So, Capricorn. The day might have a slow start. You might, to begin with, be unenthusiastic, but if you just make a small amount of effort, a consistent effort, then I think that things will really start moving for you on many different levels. Aquarius. Right now, Venus is making a trine to Uranus. Also, Venus is sextile Saturn. Now, the Venus trine Uranus, you might think that this is an aspect that has direct relevance to you. Particularly if you're of a view that Uranus rules Aquarius. I do not accept, by the way, that Uranus rules Aquarius. As far as I'm concerned, Saturn is the ruler of Aquarius, but I'm certainly prepared to accept that Uranus and Aquarius have a kind of a link. There is a certain harmony between the two, and so it's possible that this Venus trine Uranus does have an impact on you. And Venus, one sees Venus as being the planet of relationships, and so with Venus trine Uranus, there could be things going on in terms of other people and other people's behavior. But your own view on the matter is, independent-minded as ever. You're not going to give too much away. You might be aware of what other people are doing, what other people are up to, but still you are also aware of your own boundaries. And I think that right now you're going to be very good at looking after your boundaries, but in such a way that doesn't close you off. I mean, it's not just that we've got Venus trine Uranus, we also have Venus sextile Saturn. So Venus sextile Saturn, Saturn is your ruler, at least as far as I'm concerned. Saturn rules Aquarius. So if Venus is sextile Saturn, that might be about other people and how you deal with other people. And I think that you can deal with people extremely well, and you can come over as being relatively friendly. I'm not going to say warm. I mean, you can be warm if you want, but I think you can be friendly, you can be helpful, you can be constructive. Venus and Saturn have a natural relationship with one another. Venus is in Capricorn, it's in a sign ruled by Saturn. Saturn is in Pisces, which is of course the exaltation sign of Venus. So there's just a naturalness to the way you get on with people. Yeah, sure, you understand your boundaries, but there's something very constructive about it, and also maybe understated. We're not talking about necessarily dramatic events in terms of relationships, but there can be constructive interaction which makes for a day which is, straightforward, and I think that you're going to feel pretty comfortable. I don't see any reason, why you should be too bothered. I mean, you might be bothered by what other people say and what other people do. I mean, it might bother you in terms of you take note of it. You shouldn't, of course, assume that anyone is going to do exactly what you expect. But you can take it all in your stride, and it works both ways. You're quite capable of being radical and somewhat unusual yourself. I mean, when we think about it, if you think about it, Venus is trine Uranus. I mean, I will be talking about this in a moment later in the video when I talk about this Venus trine Uranus aspect in isolation. But Venus is trine Uranus. Saturn is sextile Venus, and Saturn is also sextile Uranus. So Saturn is kind of on the Venus-Uranus midpoint. So that could say something about you and your capacity to be original and to demonstrate your originality in a way that is very clearly noticed. So perhaps it's a time, Aquarius, to show people, who you are, what kind of person you are. Because if you keep too quiet, what can happen is that people can start making assumptions, and they assume through your silence that you're someone who you're not. And now might be a time to just unfurl yourself in terms of showing who you are, what kind of person you really are. Because every Aquarius is an individual, and your individuality is close to the surface. And by making things clear, you can just it's not just about putting a record straight. It's about just changing relationships in a positive way, in a way that there is sort of more sort of mutual respect. Yeah, so in fact, it works both ways. So you and other people can start to really get a good understanding of who you are. It's not a time for mysteries. You don't want to necessarily hide your true personality. Pisces. Moon is still in Sagittarius. And, with the moon in Sagittarius, it seems that there are things that you are trying to get together. And, you're having some success, but it feels rather modest. And so you shouldn't, beat yourself up if you're not getting all the results you are hoping for. It is slow, and you've got perhaps the ambition and you've got the ideas, but the question is, what are you applying yourself to? It might seem that you're applying yourself to, absolutely nothing. At least that might be your first impression. But the moon in Sagittarius is making a square to Saturn. And, as the day progresses, the moon gets closer and closer to a square to Saturn. And tomorrow, I think the square is going to be exact. I mean, maybe it's going to be late today, but when that moon squares Saturn, things might just come together. Things have taken a long time to come together, but finally you find your groove. So that may be part of what today is about. You keep trying to do something, and it's not entirely successful. You're part of a way there, but you're not all of the way there. But you keep going, and in the end, things start to make sense. But don't be impatient, and don't get frustrated. I mean, I think some Pisceans might get frustrated. You keep trying, it's not working, so you feel you need to do something different. You need to perhaps do something that, it could be unwise. You put your energy into the wrong thing out of frustration, and it backfires. So it's not a time to be doing anything radically different or unplanned, even though that might be what you want to do. So Pisces, I think that a certain amount of self-discipline could be important. And additionally, remember that Saturn is in your sign. Of course, Saturn is not the ruler of Pisces, but I think that Saturn is a planet that has a special connection to you. And at the moment, Saturn is sextile Venus. It's also pretty close to a sextile of Uranus. So with that two aspects, with Saturn hitting Venus and Uranus, and Saturn being in your sign, that might mean, Pisces, that through your own efforts you can take control of things. Yeah, you keep trying. Yeah, for a long time you are unsuccessful, but it might, or at least it might seem that you're unsuccessful, but I don't think you are. You are making an impression. You are making an impact, and perhaps you are being noticed, and you have the capacity, if you're honest with yourself and you believe in yourself, to take things which on the surface seem uncontrollable, seem chaotic, seem even a bit disturbing. You can take all of that and you can focus it, you can harness it, you can really bring it all together. And it does require some effort. So I'm certainly not saying it's going to be an easy day, Pisces, but if you really believe in yourself and you keep going and you don't make sudden changes and you don't do things that you've never done before, if you stick to the path, Pisces, then I think that you'll get there in the end. Of course, sticking to the path, I thinking of a tarot card, the moon. The moon is, of course, a tarot card which is associated with Pisces, and maybe the moon is a tarot card which is particularly appropriate for today. I think that if I remember rightly, the moon is, you are on a path, but it's you're walking in the moonlight, not the sunlight. And the problem with the moonlight is it's not real light; it's kind of imaginary, and it's easy to drift off the path. And when you leave the path, that is a world of ghosts and phantoms and projections, and it may be impossible to get back on. So don't be tempted. Keep going. Just because there's no immediate excitement, just because everything seems to be going nowhere, it doesn't mean it is going nowhere. You have got it right. And if you just tell yourself you've got it right and you keep going, then you'll be fine. And so, don't despair, don't be tempted, and it can be a great Thursday. And those are my forecasts for the 12 signs. And now it is time to look at things from the perspective of the I Ching. So I asked the question, what is Thursday going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram number 49, revolution. Yeah. There can be a change. Revolution is certainly about a change, and it's about a change that is absolutely necessary. Now, this is from the I Ching. The I Ching is an oracle that puts great store in the established order. The established order is based on the family unit, and that's how society should be structured. It is a Confucian oracle. And so where does revolution fit here? Revolution is not something that seems to be conducive to Confucian order, but revolution happens when existing structures become rotten, when they're not serving their purpose anymore. Indeed, in order to save society, we have to change society. Yeah, it needs to change every now and then. And sometimes that change has to be radical. And so, we're thinking about you, perhaps, as the revolutionary. What kind of change do you want to bring about? And it might be the case that you've been saying the same old stuff for ages and ages, and you've known that change was necessary, but maybe just no one was believing you. Perhaps you'd said the same thing, just again and again and again, and you've just been ignored. But things are changing. It is a time of revolution. So if you have been waiting for a change, waiting to institute a change, maybe now is the time. And of course, one of the big aspects of today is Venus trine Uranus. There is a Venus-Uranus. There is a revolutionary aspect to Venus trine Uranus. And it's not just Venus trine Uranus. We've also got Venus sextile Saturn. So Venus sextile Saturn, Venus trine Uranus. It is about structures and how structures change. And if you start to advocate for change, then I think people will listen. The I Ching talks about you being believed. Finally, people believe you. And the Wilhelm translation of I Ching talks about changing like a tiger. Yeah, you can change like a tiger. It's clear. And people listen. What you're saying makes sense. And at the same time, you have the absolute confidence to be able to see things through. So if you believe that a change is required, at whatever level, whether it's in your home, perhaps in your workplace, I'm not sure if I would necessarily advocate that you participate in a revolution, in a real revolution. Of course, some places there is a revolution. Well, supposedly people have been talking about the revolution in Iran, but as far as I can see, that revolution is starting to peter out. I'm not saying that on the basis of astrology. It's in terms of the news. So I'm not saying that you should go out onto the streets and risk your life. I'm thinking about revolution in a more safe, secure kind of way. But revolution might also say something about your relationship to the government, whatever your government is. There are very few governments in this world which are popular, wherever you are. And so maybe you've got something to say, but you've got to also look after your own safety. It depends how tyrannical your government is. But it does seem that whatever revolutionary ideas you have, people are going to listen to you. And we've got one moving line, fifth line moves. And because we've got a moving line, that means we move to a second hexagram, and we move to hexagram number 55, which is abundance. So it does seem that once we create the change, things really start to work well. Abundance, it's a great hexagram. In some respects, it does talk about things at their peak, things really working, things are looking good. They may not stay good forever. Abundance is perhaps, like the sun at midday. It doesn't last forever. The sun, will inevitably move down towards the western horizon, and that represents the ebb and flow of society, of human experience. But it's certainly in the short term, when you start to announce a revolution, when you announce the changes you want to make, maybe you're just announcing it to yourself. It doesn't necessarily have to be announced to the wide world. And you actually put things into action. It seems that there really is a favourable result, and things can move, and we can move to this stage of abundance where it does seem that everything is working. And now I want to switch back to the astrology, and I will start with the Venus trine Uranus. So today Venus is trine Uranus, and I just want to look at. I want to start by looking at the chart of the exact moment that this aspect happens. Venus trine Uranus. It's a trine. I'm not saying that is going to necessarily be a super spectacular aspect. But anyway, here it is. Here's the precise moment it happens. So you've got Venus at 2737 Capricorn, sextile Uranus at 2737 Taurus. So the classic way of interpreting Venus trine Uranus is to say, oh, it's excitement in relationships. Venus is a planet of relationships. Trine it's a good aspect. Uranus is about something just happening out of the blue. So you might say, oh, you're going to meet someone. It will be unexpected. It will just happen. And that's going to be great. Of course, the problem with an aspect like Venus trine Uranus, particularly if you're talking about people's love lives, and of course there's always pressure on astrologers to talk about love lives, that it's creating an unreal expectation. Venus trine Uranus, it's not such an unusual aspect. It does happen a couple of times a year. And so with Venus trine Uranus, are you going to have these amazing romantic events? And I think sun sign astrologers, or they used to call them sun sign astrologers in the days before people knew their ascendants, but sun sign astrologers would traditionally make a big play on this Venus trine Uranus. And if you read your daily forecast for today, you'll see that Venus trine Uranus, particularly if you're a Taurus or a Taurus or a Libra, you're ruled by Venus. But that's certainly a way of looking at Venus trine Uranus. I would have said that's probably one of the less useful ways of looking at Venus trine Uranus. You have to see it in other ways. I mean, Venus is not just about relationships. Venus is about art. It's about beauty. It's perhaps about creating something that is different. So if you are an artist and you are painting a picture with Venus trine Uranus, it might be something quite individualistic, and it might be quite radical. Of course, Venus is in Capricorn and Uranus in Taurus, so it's quite earthy. So Venus trine Uranus could be about a sculptor, something three-dimensional. So if you're a sculptor, you're trying to build something, that would be a way of looking at it. Or it might be about what you are doing in the garden. If you're doing something in the garden, I mean, I don't really know about gardening. It's not my thing. But with Venus trine Uranus, it could be about doing something interesting, with plants. So being individualistic in that department. It could be art. Art has many forms, and art can be about cooking, decorating, doing things that are different, maybe too different. And as far as the creativity is concerned, by the way, the Sun is conjunct the Mercury-Venus midpoint right now, and so that adds something else to this conjunction. It does support the idea that this Venus trine Uranus can be a very creative influence. So my advice to you is that you can certainly be creative. Try your hardest. If it's something you're good at, something you're good at. If you're good at, if you're an artist, a cook, gardener, whatever it is, you've got to consider the situation and the weather and the circumstances. But it seems you can create something special and something unique. And when we're talking about unique, we're talking about independence. That's a different way of looking at it. Venus trine Uranus may represent a time when we really do value our independence. I've talked about love lives and relationships. It may be that for some people that's the last thing anyone wants, or last thing that someone wants, because Venus trine Uranus wants to do things your way. and having someone else involved, well, that just could spoil things. And one feature of this particular Venus trine Uranus is the fact that it's involved with Saturn. So you will see that Saturn is at 27 Pisces. So Saturn is sextile Uranus, Saturn is sextile Venus. So we can break those two sextiles up. We can say, well, we've got Venus sextile Saturn. Now, Venus sextile Saturn is quite a cool aspect, isn't it? I mean, I know that Venus and Saturn are in mixed mutual reception, but it is quite cool, and it's about respecting one's independence and one's individuality, and wanting to do things your way. And it's probably not an especially emotional aspect. I mean, I know that Saturn is in Pisces, but it likes to have some distance. I'm not saying that Venus-Saturn sextile can't be good for relationships. It can be. For example, if Saturn is your ruler, if you're an Aquarius or a Capricorn, it can help in terms of relationships. But it's not full-blown emotional, not really. And then Saturn sextile Uranus, that's coming up, this Saturn sextile Uranus. And there's a bit of tension there, but it's Saturn sextile Uranus, so it's constructive tension. And so, overall, Saturn's role is quite individualistic. And we can also see Saturn as being on the Venus-Uranus midpoint. Now, if you throw in Saturn, you might not want to be so positive about relationships, because you could say Venus and Uranus represent a sudden change in relationships. Perhaps someone asserting their independence, someone appearing out of nowhere, but also perhaps disappearing. And so when you put Saturn on the Venus-Uranus midpoint, you could interpret that as being a sudden disruption in a relationship, a disruption that comes from nowhere. And when you're talking about midpoints, always a good idea to look at Alfred Witter's rules for planetary pictures. And so looking at what Alfred Witter says about Saturn on the Venus-Uranus midpoint, he says, Saturn on the Venus-Uranus midpoint, he says, sudden, interrupted or separated love union. So that's kind of what I was saying. So don't get too into this Venus trine Uranus and thinking it's good for relationships if Saturn is on the Venus-Uranus midpoint, because this could be a sudden interruption. A relationship which seems to be developing suddenly breaks up. I'm not saying that's going to relate to any long-term relationship, but if you've been involved with someone for whatever reason, maybe for a few days or a few weeks, that Saturn on the Venus-Uranus midpoint could indeed be quite disruptive. And looking at Ebertin, combination of stellar influences, both Witter and Ebertin, these two books, I regard them as being essential reading. I still think that books are important. And so Ebertin says about Saturn on the Venus-Uranus midpoint, he says a controlled sensuality, suppressed tensions in love life, passing sexual and emotional inhibitions, the awakening from love drunkenness, estrangement and separation. So it is a similar picture. So we shouldn't get too excited from a relationship angle about this Venus-Uranus trine, because we have to consider Saturn's role here. Now, one person who may be impacted by all of this is Jerome Powell. I have been looking at Jerome Powell's horoscope, and so here is where's Jerome Powell? I don't have a time of birth for Jerome Powell. So he's chair of the Federal Reserve. Trump wants to reduce interest rates. I get the impression that Trump and Jerome Powell don't get on with each other. I think that there's certainly an argument that the Federal Reserve have been acting politically. I think that they lowered interest rates just before the last election. It seemed as if they were trying to help the Democrats. And you could argue that the Federal Reserve, is, or perhaps Powell is acting to undermine Trump. You should never, ever assume that people like Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve are objective. And I'm not really making a partisan point. People are not objective. They might claim to be, but they're not. And so there might be some merit in Trump's problems with Jerome Powell. But of course, Trump being Trump, he's now on the attack. And Jerome Powell, I think he made some testimony to Congress about refurbishments at the Federal Reserve. Is that at the Federal Reserve building? And it's been claimed that there might have been some inaccuracies there. It's perhaps alleged, I think, that he was lying. And so now Jerome Powell is finding himself under investigation. So this perhaps is not surprising given Jerome Powell's horoscope. So Jerome Powell's Mars is approximately at 27, 28 Pisces. I mean, I don't know his time of birth, but it will be somewhere around there. Relatively close to Skeet. I think Jerome Powell's Mars is a bit of a problem, and you can imagine Jerome Powell with his Mars in Pisces. I think that supports the idea that Jerome Powell is quite subjective. Yeah, you might look at his chart, Jerome Powell's chart, and say, oh, he's got all this stuff in Aquarius. He's got the Sun in Aquarius. He's got Mercury in Aquarius. He's got Moon in Libra. The objectivity of those planets, and that he can do what is right for the American economy. But that Mars in Pisces is a problem, and there could be a subjectivity there. And that Mars is now under real attack. So let me just show you the nature of this attack. So we'll put Jerome Powell's chart in the middle. We'll put Venus trine Uranus on the outer wheel. So there is his Mars and there is Saturn. So Saturn is now applying to Jerome Powell's Mars. He's also got Venus right now. He's got Venus sextile his Mars. He's got Uranus sextile his Mars. So this whole configuration is right on his Mars. So maybe Powell needs to be careful. Maybe the pressure on him, is perhaps quite overwhelming. I mean, I don't know whether or not he's going to resign. I think that with Jerome Powell, he's got those Aquarian planets, and one can imagine this is a man who is quite stubborn. He's going to dig in. He's going to dig in as long as he can, but it's not pretty. And I don't think it's pretty, the fact that he's got this Saturn hitting his Mars, and I don't know how that's going to work. Maybe he'll weather the storm, but even if he does weather the storm, as Saturn moves onto the Aries point, you can see that Powell has a Venus-Mars conjunction, and so what's going to happen is that Saturn is going to make the opposition to Mars, conjunction to Mars, and then as it moves into Aries, it will be on his Venus-Mars midpoint. So Saturn is not going away, and then Saturn will eventually get to the conjunction with Venus. So it might be best for Powell if he resigns now. I think that Saturn could cause him a lot of trouble, but I'm only just looking at one thing in his horoscope. Maybe I'll look at his chart in greater detail at a later stage. Now, as far as birthdays are concerned, it's January the 15th. It's Martin Luther King's birthday. It's also the birthday of the Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni. Here is Giorgia Meloni's chart. Now, Giorgia Meloni, she's quite exceptional because she's lasted so long, and so Giorgia Meloni has her sun in Capricorn. She's got Saturn rising. That's a great Saturn rising. I know Saturn is in its detriment in Leo, but the thing is, it's in mutual reception with the Sun. The Sun is in Capricorn, the sign of Saturn. Saturn is in Leo, the sign of the Sun. So I think that mutual reception really helps her in terms of her being able to stay in power. I mean, how long is it going to last? I don't know. Of course, Saturn and Neptune are moving into Aries. She's quite soon going to have Saturn square her Mercury and her Mercury and Mars, so that's going to be happening. She's also got Mars square Pluto, so maybe Saturn will cause her trouble, maybe it won't. But I do want to just wish Giorgia Meloni happy birthday. It would also be the birthday of Edward Teller, the creator of the hydrogen bomb. He was born on January the 15th, 1908. What's kind of interesting about Edward Teller's chart, I don't have a time of birth for him, but he's got Uranus conjunct the South Node. We often think about the South Node as being the past, what we should be moving away from, but it's tempting, isn't it? We can't get away from it. It is a line of least resistance, and so with South Node conjunct Uranus, well, he couldn't help himself, could he? He just had to get involved with atomic bombs. He just kept going, and he was a real advocate of atomic bombs, and he wanted America to have as many bombs as possible. He wanted America to stand up against communism, and by the way, at the time of the actual detonation of the atomic bomb, Mars was at 14 Capricorn. So, sorry, not the atomic bomb, the detonation of the hydrogen bomb. He was really excited about it. He didn't go to the test site, but he was looking at the seismograph, waiting for that first sign that the bomb had gone off. And so Mars was at 24 degrees 14 Capricorn, and so that Mars was pretty close to his was kind of on his south node, and pretty close to his Uranus as well. And of course it is Martin Luther King's birthday, so happy birthday to Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King was, I think he was born around noon, so he's got his sun on the midheaven, and so here is his chart. I think that Capricorn is a sign which can just keep going, can keep it doesn't keep going. It's very persistent. Once it decides it wants something, it does just marches on. And he had Mars opposition Saturn. So Mars opposition Saturn, of course, can be a problem aspect. It can represent death, or perhaps in his case it's an early death as well, because he was only 39 when he was assassinated, I think. And so that Mars opposition Saturn is quite grinding. It's quite it's hard work. But maybe if you're doing something like he was doing, if you're being something of a revolutionary, I mean a revolutionary in several different ways. It's not just a revolution. It's not just about being a revolutionary in terms of standing up against segregation and so forth. You have to kind of deal with your own people and looking for a non-violent path. When I say dealing with his own people, I'm talking about his own supporters, and those supporters some of them might be advocating a more violent path, and he has to stand up against that. So perhaps he has to be a revolutionary in many different ways, not just against the segregationist authorities. And so Mars opposition Saturn, it's quite difficult. And this Mars opposition Saturn, I believe, was linked with his death. If you take primary directions, because with a primary direction, you remember with a primary direction, every degree that the Earth moves represents 1 year. So he was born at, if we take him being born at noon, and look at Saturn. Saturn has passed the midheaven, and Saturn is moving down towards the descendant. So as the Earth turns, Saturn will go lower and lower on the horizon. And so that point when Saturn crosses the horizon could be quite difficult, and particularly as Mars is opposition Saturn. So if we move the Earth approximately 39 degrees, that equates to 12 o'clock. That would be 2 hours and 37 minutes after he was born. So 2 hours and 37 minutes after he was born, the Earth had turned 39 degrees and Saturn had crossed the descendant exactly, or rather had crossed the western horizon. And so that kind of links with his own death. And of course, it's not just Saturn, it's the fact that Mars is tied up with it as well. So that's quite poignant in terms of describing his death. But anyway, he would be 97 years old, and so wherever he is, I wish Martin Luther King a happy 97th birthday. So thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, I'd be very grateful if you would like it. If you're not subscribed, super grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.